we left Europe, right? Now, I think there's something that people are not able to be entirely honest about here, because there was a lot of talk about we're going to leave Europe, and a lot of maybe the left, let's say, tarred everyone who voted for Brexit as, oh, they're a bunch of racists or whatever. And people who voted for Brexit, no, it's not about that. It's about bureaucracy and having control of our borders and these kinds of things, and nothing to do with race. And I don't think it is, by the way. But I think what's being lost in the middle somewhere is that Brexit wouldn't have been won if people weren't so concerned about, and rightly so, immigration, particularly Islamic immigration. I think that is a key issue. We wanted to have control of our borders, at least. What's actually happened, and I'm sure even those who voted Brexit knew this might happen, is we've got control of our borders and we're letting even more people in that are making this country multicultural in a certain way that isn't necessarily liberal. So has Brexit failed, and what do we do?
Well, first of all, I would argue we don't have Brexit. The thing is, and I always use an analogy if I'm speaking at universities, imagine the civil servants didn't want Brexit. Parliament didn't want Brexit. The House of Lords didn't want Brexit. The mainstream media and the press didn't, with the exception of the Daily Express, didn't want Brexit, so on and so forth. Now, imagine if you're on a train, and there's lots and lots of people on the train, there's hundreds and hundreds of people on the train, and you're going to Scarborough because you want a day out in Scarborough. And everybody's all dressed up for the Scarborough. They're really looking forward to this trip to Scarborough, and the sun's shining. But the train driver and the signalman want the train to go to Manchester. Now, where do you think the train would go?
Well, I'd like to think that these people are doing their jobs and they would take the train to Scarborough.
So would I, but of course we know that they're not. We haven't had all the people who didn't want it control the levers of power in every regard. And of course, if you talk about the divide in the country, I would argue, and I was quite experienced in campaigning for this Brexit, we had an interesting situation where all the people say, oh, it's dividing the country is divided, and so on and so forth. Now, the country is not, people think the country might be divided. It's not divided in age, and I don't accept that it's divided particularly, certainly, possibly in the latter years, but wasn't divided by race. It wasn't divided by wealth. We now have a society which is divided by whether you work in the public sector or you don't work in the public sector. Are you in the wealth-creating sector or are you not in the wealth-creating sector? And this is the problem we have. If you work in the public sector, you are unsackable. You have an index-linked pension, which is unbelievably generous, and you couldn't get it in the private sector. And it facilitates retirement at age 55. Onwards. Generally, that is the fact of the matter. And I know about these things. I used to manage pension funds in the City of London. So I know about this kind of stuff.
This is what President Milei in Argentina that was his number one target.
He is, which is one of the reasons I'm going down there to South America in March.
Can you get me Milei? Do you know him?
No, but I might know him by the time I get back, because we're both sort of supporters of the same institute, the Mises Institute, and the von Mises attitude to.
Okay.
It might happen, and I'm meeting.
Well, let me know, and let me.
I will most certainly.
Because I could do him in Spanish. I could interview him in Spanish.
Well, yes, I did read that you had these languages skills. Well, I will certainly be your disciple, or ambassador, perhaps is a better word. So yes, I'll certainly look at that. But he realised that you cannot have everybody sucking at the public teat. You can't. If you want your hospitals, if you want your doctors, if you want your roads, it all comes from the wealth-creating sector. It comes from the because it's either taxation or the money is borrowed.
Right.
That's the only place the money can come from. And we cannot afford millions and millions, 6, 7, 8 million people in the public sector. We cannot afford nearly 1,000 quangos. They've added quangos since in the last 6 months. More quangos. And if you actually look at what these people do, they're not wealth creating. And they're all on index-linked pensions, so on and so forth. And so the public ticket now is running into 2-3 trillion pounds in order to fund these. You can only fund these things if you borrow, or when you can't borrow and gilt yields are going up now because of the instability of our economy, you then print money. which is called quantitative easing, but you and I would call counterfeiting. And of course, then what happens is that, of course, it degrades your currency, and your currency then goes down. We're now at something like 125 against the dollar, and the dollar's in trouble. That's how fast sterling's going down.
It's really scary, and that's the inflation that I saw for years in Argentina living there.
Exactly.
I actually, I'm not exaggerating. By the end, before Milei got in, and even now because they're still trying to figure this out, I would go to restaurants with a bag full of notes. Because the notes, they weren't able to print higher denominations in time for the inflation. So you had all these 1,000 peso notes, and lunch was like 300,000 pesos. So you're sitting there just going 1, 2, and you're sitting counting, everyone's in restaurants counting the ones to get to 300 with these bags of money. And I thought, right, well, this is a country where things have gone
It's terrifying.
off,
and of course, the Germans saw it and Austrians saw it in the early 1920s. And I saw it in the 70s to an extent, galloping inflation in the mid-1970s, early 1970s. So you go into the corner shop and you want some coffee and you want a tin of baked beans or whatever batch of stuff you buy.
Coffee and beans.
All that kind of stuff. So I'm going in there. And some of the staff were sitting down. It was a sort of corner shop, a Spar or a co-op or whatever it was. Most of the staff were relabeling. And when you got your pot of coffee, there were 5 or 6 labels on it. It'd been restamped, 5 or 6. That is very frightening.
Yeah.
And it needs to be dealt with. And you can't print your way out of it. I mean, it's suicidal to print your money. And this government and the Fed, all they can do is print their way out because they can't raise enough taxation to cover their outgoings. But nobody in the political dynamic, either in this country, well, certainly this country, I've never heard at any general election anybody talk about cutting public spending. Have you ever heard anybody go to the country and say we're going to cut government spending? They don't. They're going to say we're going to grow GDP. We're going to do all sorts of clever things. But nobody says we're going to cut government spending. And the only way you can deal with all these problems is to cut. The kids in our universities have been brought up reading economics in our state universities, probably for 3 generations now, believing that somehow the state isn't like a family or a small business. You cannot borrow money ad infinitum without it biting you in the arse. You can't do it. It ain't possible for a government. It's not possible for a company. It's not possible for anybody else. You can't go on and on borrowing. You just can't. And we're seeing that now.
You know what's sad for me about Brexit was I did that Erasmus program, the student thing.
Yes.
Went and lived in France, and that was great. And in the past, I mean, these are I understand sort of maybe luxury beliefs on my part because I know not everybody is thinking about going off and studying for a year abroad. But those were things that were on my mind at the time of the vote. Like, it's a bit sad not to be able to have that link to Europe. I like Europe, and I like being able to go to the airport and not have this separate line and things like that. It is a bit complex now. But then there's the other side of, well, okay, but at least we can control our borders. Now that we don't necessarily get as much immigration from Europe, is that we're just getting more from places like Pakistan? Is that right?
Yes, and I'll pick you up on a couple of points there, which you won't have known. You won't have known at the time because it was quite deliberate that you didn't know. And one was that the Erasmus system was open to us even post-Brexit. Now,
even now?
Yes, even Michael Caine would say, not a lot of people know that. So it was still there. And of course, the Europeans were getting as much out of the Erasmus system as we were, and it was a very good thing. And I was a big supporter of it. I thought it was a good thing. So the Erasmus program was available.
That's the student. For those who don't know, the student being able to live and study abroad.
Yeah, study abroad with the minimum of bureaucracy. It wasn't as cheap. As there was a bit more of a tariff on you being able to do that, but it wasn't a game changer. It wasn't a deal breaker.
Okay.
And as far as travel is concerned, of course, and nobody knows more about it than me because I was flying to and from Brussels for 10 years and Strasbourg. You still had to get, when you landed at Brussels or Strasbourg, show your passport. We didn't have an open.
But there's a separate line. The line's longer.
You couldn't waft your way through. You had to. There was one line that you didn't have to show anything at all if you were part of the Schengen agreement.
Yeah.
We were never part of the Schengen agreement, so even when we were in, we couldn't come and go as we chose. We still had part.
But there's there's one line for Europeans, and there's one that we have to be in now.
Yes,
and it's a bit longer usually.
yeah. Oh dear.
Well, that's
not really a big deal, is it?
Yeah, but
and don't forget they do that deliberately.
Yeah,
that's deliberate. Now, if we
Yes.
had negotiated with goodwill, if I had been negotiating, that wouldn't have happened. I would have made part of the deal that with Brexit we're going, we're returning to self-government. In short, we are returning to self-government. We are 80-20. We accept 80% of European goods to 20% of Europe. They accept 20% of ours, right? It's an 80-20 standoff. We are in the driving seat from a negotiating position. We are the customer, big time. You will do the following things. Or there'll be no more Peugeots, there'll be no more BMWs, there'll be no more Mercedes, there'll be no more French wine. Do you really want us to punish you in this way? Because we're in the driving seat. All we're asking for is a fair shake. And so we want this, this and this. But nobody did that. We sent negotiators quite deliberately. Hillary, I think his name was. One of the guys that we sent was deliberately there to sabotage the negotiations. Theresa May was sabotaging. She was a Remainer. So they wanted the worst conceivable deal. They didn't want Brexit. And we didn't get Brexit. We should have moved forward in a situation we should have taken as our role model as a state, post-war Hong Kong under Sir John Cooperthwaite, who said, right, my responsibility is to make sure the drains work and the police aren't corrupt. Nothing else, the rest of it is up to you. And of course, we saw Hong Kong overtake our own GDP per capita, in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And it was the same with Lord Salisbury. Let me go back to Lord Salisbury again. In 1890, I think another wonderful quote is, the job of myself and my government is to facilitate the entrepreneurship of the British people. That is Parliament's responsibility. Not to micromanage the economy. His job was to keep out of everybody's way and let them get on with it. When did we last hear a government coming to power saying, we're going to get out of your way? If you want to start a business, if your son or your daughter wants to start a little business and you give them $5,000 to get it started, there's no forms to fill in at all. What's wrong with that?
Yeah.
Which is how we produced an empire. And the Americans produced themselves to be the most powerful nation on the planet. It was that kind of system.